Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Neglect Matters campaign. This 1-hour lunch and learn session will begin with a presentation by Margaret Gallagher, NSPCC Head of Local Campaigns. She'll be speaking about the impact of COVID on childhood neglect and how to move forward. This will be followed by Paul Bailey, Partnership Development Team Manager, speaking about the findings from recent serious case reviews. There will be a personal film clip on childhood neglect, ending with a video presentation from our GCP2 project manager. The Academy training offers on neglect can be found on the final slides, and links will be posted in the Q&A available to all attendees. The format of the Teams live session is such that you cannot verbally interact with the presenters, but please do feel free to send any questions through the Q&A option. These will be collated at the end of the session and answers sent out to you. We would encourage you all not just to listen to these sessions, but to use this information to help us all improve the lives of children, young people and their families in Surrey. Thank you very much.
So I'm delighted to be here today. I'm Margaret Gallagher, the head of local campaigns for the NSPCC, and I am sure that most of you are aware of the society, but we are over 136 years old, and our key aim is to end cruelty to children by seeking to influence legislation, policy, practice, attitudes and behaviours for the benefit of children and young people. And we achieve this through a combination of service provision, lobbying, campaigning and public education. Our services include our NSPCC Adults Helpline for adults that are worried about a child, and Childline, the UK's free confidential helpline for children and young people, as well as a range of other services, including our children's services. So I'm going to speak to you today about the impact of COVID, what we have learned and how we think we must respond as a community and as agencies to move forward. So next slide, please. So our NSPCC helpline has been running for well over 35 years across the UK, and it's in a helpline where adults come to us to talk about concerns about children and young people that they know, or families that need support. So in the year 2020-21, up until the end of March this year, we responded to almost 85,000 contacts from people with concerns about a child's welfare. These figures peaked in May, as you can imagine, with the whole pandemic, how that impacted on what we were developing and delivering. And we know that during May, we had contacts that were 48% higher than the pre-lockdown average. So we were having to respond quite dramatically to that surge in contacts about concerns about families and about children. However, we also know that we had a helpline campaign supported by the government, and that helped highlight that we really particularly needed at that time for all adults in the community to be more aware and be more mindful of families that may be struggling, if they had concerns about children who were no longer in contact with their normal services, like schools, like support agencies, and for everyone to take a more proactive role in passing on concerns. We know then that the overall figure for the year was that we responded to nearly a quarter higher than average contacts to our helpline. So that then sustained throughout the year, and we had different peaks, high and low, as children went back to school. And we also had a peak then again earlier this year. The second lockdown was particularly difficult for families. So again, we were seeing variations slightly in regions as well. If we look at the next slide.
Yeah.
So when we talk about referrals, that is all contacts that I've mentioned before, those huge number of contacts to our helpline. But where we had concerns that we believe were serious enough to be passed on to another agency, that happened in 47% of the contacts that came through to us. More immediate action, and that we weren't able to give advice or signpost to services. As you can see, that was nearly 39,995, nearly 40,000, that resulted in either a new referral or an update to an existing referral about a family or a child that was known to through social services. So again, quite a significant number across the UK, and we were seeing an increase in those types of referrals we were making during lockdown. So if we move to the next slide.
Yeah.
What were those referrals telling us? What were those even the advice contacts telling us? We knew that the top concern, which was an increase of 42% to more than 20,400 contacts, worries about parental alcohol and substance misuse, domestic abuse, and parental mental health. Widely echoed, as you know, around your own service providers, your own contacts to your local services in your area. And we were seeing that reflected in contacts to the helpline. And that was the top concern. However, we were looking at the neglect campaign with yourselves in Surrey. What was of increased concern to us was also the increase in neglect itself. So we had a 15% increase to more than 12,800 contacts. So it was the second area of highest concern reported to the helpline. But as you will also know, as practitioners and others supporting families in various ways, neglect does not only present its own, it also can come along with, particularly physical abuse, which increased 18% to more than 12,600 contacts. We did see at one point last year a significant rise in physical abuse towards older children as well, which again, we are talking about that later in the week around adolescent neglect, but of great concern to us that physical abuse has been increasing over the years. And again, we did see that as a significant increase. We know that emotional abuse also increased to 4 times more than normal. And in terms of, for us, we know that emotional neglect and emotional abuse are often sometimes the areas that professionals and those in the community find hardest to articulate, to describe, to know that's met a threshold for concern. So again, if we look at those figures, a significant increase in that area as well. What I would note now as we move on to the next slide is that also in terms of police offences, the number of recorded child cruelty and neglect offences have been up by 53% over the last 3 years. We reported that on the end of December 2020. So from 2017 to 2020, we are looking at a 53% increase in child cruelty and neglect offences. It varies by region, it varies by nation, but we are very concerned as well, along with our police colleagues, around that increase. And again, we know that during the 12-month period between 2019 and 2020, there were actually 22,529 recorded offences. So again, that is again where the threshold is met for action to be taken by the police and contacts to the police. So this overall increase in concerns echo from our frontline teams, what we're hearing from the pandemic. And I suppose our helpline in one sense gives us a very real sense check of what's going on in the community, because it's a live service, it's operating throughout the pandemic, slightly reduced hours, but it gave us a really good insight into how things were for families and for communities. As often it would be neighbours, delivery drivers, other people that contact us about concerns about children and young people. But it echoed our frontline teams' concerns that the impact of the pandemic was increasing the risk for those who were more vulnerable as well, already going into the pandemic, as they were out of sight of those who could keep them safe, such as their teachers, their support workers, family extended networks, those places that they could go to and seek support and seek safety at times when there was risk to them within their family and their settings, as you know, within the family home. What we are very concerned about is that with most children back in schools and society is opening up more, that those hidden harms, those stressors that they experienced during the lockdown will become more visible. And I suppose from our response around COVID, what we're saying is now it's actually a time that all of us will need to be more alert, to be more tuned in, and have those services available for children and young people. And if we just move to the next case study around the helpline and neglect, these would be fairly typical calls that come through to our helpline. You know, this was a child who was found crying the side of the road, and that happened on quite a number of occasions where children were found distressed, come across on their own in the community, and it was more noticeable during lockdown because we didn't have that many people out and about in the streets day to day. So these young woman, Chloe and Deborah, found a young boy. He was very scared. He had been hit. He was feeling very upset and worried because he had broken his TV and was worried about what his mother would do. So again, they contacted our helpline, and again, you can see they were able to safety. And I know that you know, for them to have the reassurance, the helpline was there for advice. So again, trying to support people who, when they see neglect, when they see abuse, to take action. You know, not sure what to do. Maybe they don't have their local numbers at hand, but certainly we link in with our local practitioners as well in each area across the UK to make sure those cases are moved forward, both with police and immediately, but also with our children's services colleagues and others. But this would be fairly typical around a contact to the helpline, around a concern about a child who may be distressed or witnessed in that situation. But we also have instances, many instances, where homes now, where we don't have services going in, where people were concerned and they let us know about the concern, particularly around neglect and abuse of children. So we moved to the next slide around the Childline experience. And again, we have a section on our Childline website, and I would encourage you to look at it. Many people think our Childline website, it is for children, it is primarily a service for children. But as practitioners and support workers, it would be interesting for you to look at it and see, how do we speak to children around neglect? Because children tell us about their lives. They don't use the word neglect. They talk about not being cared for, not being fed, feeling unloved, and various things that we know are the indicators. And I'm sure as the week has gone on, we've looked at the categories of neglect, but children describe their lives to us, and then we respond to them. So these were children who have been locked up. There's been drug dealing going on, not been looked after adequately, been locked in their room, been fed takeaway, and no love or care, attention, and police sometimes coming around the house as well, and they're being raids. But again, that's, you know, we also know that neglect can be like what is described as a wallpaper issue, where we might be responding to more immediate needs. But for these young people, neglect can be going on a long time before COVID came, but certainly COVID exacerbated the conditions around neglect in homes and in communities, and lack of access to financial support, change in circumstances, and a whole range of things. That lack of emotional resilience that they might get from going to school, being in a safe place, has really impacted on children and young people. Next slide. What we are looking at and what we are asking for, we're looking at more support for services in the front line, more support for family support as well. But the key findings that we have from what we've looked at during this time, and this is a briefing paper that's available after today, is that we've seen those increases in shared dependence caregivers have made the risk of child abuse higher. Their caregivers have become overloaded as well. We know that young people have become more vulnerable because of the pandemic, and it has heightened that vulnerability of children and young people to certain types of abuse. We know there's been a reduction in the normal protective services. So again, as we move on to the last couple of slides, we would be recommending a national and local response from governments and statutory agencies, which includes practice steps such as giving those practice supports to parents around income, reduce the stress around financial worries. Those access to technology as well was very important. Coming out of lockdown, it may not be so, but again, we still are not seeing the same frontline services. So helplines, support services delivered over Zoom, not ideal, but maintaining contact with families that are particularly vulnerable is important. And we do believe investment is critical, and not just around education and educational capital. So we look at our policy approach in the next slide. We have our own policy calls for the UK government, and you can see them there around delivering the best start in life vision and investment in rebuilding health visitor workforce and new accountability mechanisms for new parents in particular, because that early intervention approach doesn't go away and certainly is all the more important now to rebuild as we go forward from this pandemic. And again, that gap in social care and that early intervention, critically important for that enhancing the mental health and emotional well-being support in schools. But we need much more than just education and educational catch-up, and we have spoken about that in the media in the recent weeks, given the government's recent announcement about their package. Again, we always are wishing to help children recover from sexual abuse. Today is primarily about neglect, but we have been seeing an increase, particularly in online sex abuse as well, so that would be our call to government. So thank you for listening to me today. I hope I haven't run over time. We had a few technical difficulties, which I won't elaborate on, but I hope I haven't gone over on time, and thank you for having me here today, and I'd be more than welcome. Any questions at the end, I will be on after the session if you'd like to ask me any questions around that presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And so I've got an echo in the background somewhere. Okay, that's better. So thank you very much. And one of the reasons why we are doing this campaign is because neglect is an urgent safeguarding issue which demands an urgent and skilled safeguarding response. It is also one of the safeguarding partnerships top priorities, one of the things that we really want to get a handle on. The image in front of you is of a frog in a saucepan. And those of you who are familiar with frogs and saucepans will know that a frog will continually adapt its bodily temperature to meet its environment, and even to the point of boiling. And so unlike other forms of harm, neglect doesn't scream out for practitioners' attention, but like the frog in the saucepan, the impact of neglect is gradual, it's continuous, and it's cumulative, ultimately resulting in harm. And so when we think about the impact of neglect, really thinking about the lack of stimulation that results in delayed speech and language, and the developmental and developmentally insecure attachments, the pervasive long-term and cumulative impact of neglect on the well-being of children. It's well documented in terms of research, and it's really important that we all work together to get a handle on it. Next slide, please. So what are we learning from our local system? I think one of the first things is that practice is too variable. And what we mean by this is that there is not a shared understanding and a shared response to the issue of neglect. Neglect is not always seen as a multi-causal issue. And so as a result of that, it's unlikely that one intervention or one series of interventions is going to be effective. So it's about how well we work together in a continuous way to address neglect and to keep children safe. The next thing is neglect can often go unrecognized and unchallenged because, again, as I said at the very beginning, it's not a harm that children necessarily are screaming out for attention, but it is the unmitigating drip, drip, drip impact of neglect over time. The other thing to say is that, third point, is that we're incident driven. And what do I mean? I mean, oftentimes it's an incident in which a child has fallen or been harmed as a result of neglect, and that triggers our action, whereas what we know from serious case reviews within our local system and learning, local child safeguarding practice reviews, is that oftentimes the antecedents to the incident were known, but we did not take appropriate action. Research from Ofsted shows that an incident-based child protection system does not allow a helpful or effective response to neglect, which typically builds over time, often without an identifiable trigger event or the sort that would lead to protective action. And this is why we have sometimes issues around threshold. Does it meet the threshold or does it not meet the threshold? So we're asking colleagues not to think about the individual incident, but what is the pattern of care over time. So, and this goes to the next point, where there is a need to learn from history and avoid the start again syndrome. So when we think about our work with families, what is the pattern, especially families that hover around threshold, that come in and out of the system, where there are multiple plans or multiple referrals coming in? What does that mean? And then the next area where we need to strengthen our practice is how we deal with neglect and affluence. And what we mean by this is that oftentimes we are really clear about working with families where neglect is a function of poverty and other societal issues. But when a family has all of the accoutrement of wealth, of position and power, but children are being emotionally neglected, they're not getting guidance and boundaries, children do not get the oversight and supervision that they need in order to be secure, but they are left largely to their own devices, that form of neglect is not always recognized. In addition to that, when we have families who are quite powerful, who are quite articulate, are able to use lawyers, we can sometimes struggle to engage with families effectively. Next slide, please. So this is from the work of Professor Ray Jones from the university, from Kingston University. And Professor Jones has a typology of 3 types of neglect. Passive neglect is really what happens when families are overwhelmed. There's so much going on, and they're exhausted by their personal circumstances. And so what you get is what is called passive neglect. Type 2 has to do with chaotic neglect, and that is where parents themselves have had compromised care. They've had adverse childhood experiences. They may be dealing with multiple parental issues, including substance misuse, poor parental health, learning difficulties. They may be in survival mode as a result of experiencing domestic abuse, including coercive control, and therefore they are unable to keep the needs of their child in mind all the time. And as a result of that, they are unable to consistently give children what they need. And then the third type of neglect is what we call active neglect. And this is the kind of neglect we see in the case of Daniel Pelka and Victoria Klimbier, when the meaning of the child within that family is one where the child is not liked and is neglected because they are not liked. And it's in these cases that we often see neglect coupled with physical abuse and sexual abuse and other forms of abuse. Thinking about these 3 typologies, if we go to the next slide, Professor Jones notes that both type 1 and 2 of neglect are slow burning examples of the frog in the saucepan. They raise the very difficult issue of if and when to conclude that it is not getting better despite the interventions and is no longer to be tolerated for the child. And this is where oftentimes we have debates about escalation, about whether or not a case meets threshold. But it's so important for us to think about what is the impact on the child over time, and we're not looking at individual incidences, but we're looking at the patterns of care and the consistency within those patterns, and then we're able to intervene effectively. Next slide, please. This is what we call the ecological transactional analysis model. And I don't say this just to sound clever, but it's been developed by Dr. Marianne Brandon and other colleagues who normally do the triennial analysis of serious case reviews. And what is useful about this particular model is it deals with the dynamic interactions of factors in cases of neglect. So, for example, the parent's own history of care, and then of course the caregiver's state of mind, their reflective function, or their ability to hold consistently the needs of their child in mind and respond appropriately. And then of course we've got the impact of the caregiving environment. What's that like for a child? And then the child's adaptive behavior strategies in order to respond to both the care that they're receiving, but also the environment in which they live. And then, of course, at the side, we've got social and environmental stresses. And so if you think about this model, the most dynamic area is area of the caregiver state of mind. If we can correctly and effectively assess the capacity of the parents and their motivation to change, and then we can support and build scaffolding around that capacity and motivation, we are likely to have a much more sustainable intervention that improves conditions for the child. That's why things like motivational interviewing is really, really important. While I'm here, it's really important to think about, if we have a child that has experienced neglect, getting them out of the neglectful situation, either by promoting the conditions of change for the parent, or alternatively having to remove the child from that family's care because they are unable to adequately care for the child. We need to think about what therapeutic interventions we give to the child to help them make meaning of their situation and their circumstance. Case review after case review, particularly of adolescents, show that oftentimes the issues that we see that are worrying in adolescents often have come from adverse childhood experiences of neglect early in life of that child. And so part of the challenge we've seen in our work with children and families goes to the next slide, where we really do need to have a clear understanding of what neglect is. This definition comes from Working Together 2018, which is free, downloadable, and freely available. And what it defines neglect as the persistent failure to meet a child's basic physical or psychological needs, which is likely to result in serious impairment of the child's health or development. I'm not going to labor this point too much, but we need to think about persistence. How persistent is persistent? How many times has the child been left? How many times has the child come to school dirty? How many times is the child come to school tired, unfocused, hungry? How many times has the child been exposed to being left behind at home? How many times has parent presented as drunk or under the influence of substance? How many times has the child been exposed to domestic violence and not had their needs met as a result? And then we need to also think about the impairment, which is serious impairment. And so it's things like understanding what's the impact of medical neglect, where a child's dental needs aren't being met, and as a result of the child, for example, being left with soothers in their mouth and the shape of their mouth changes, but also speech and language difficulties as a result of that. Need to just think those things through. And then we come through to a typology on the next slide of the various types of neglect. And I know we've addressed this in other presentations, so I'm not going to labor this point, but it's just helpful for us to think about. On the point of nutritional neglect, it's important for us to think about not only malnourishment as a result of underfeeding, but malnourishment as a result of overfeeding the wrong foods. So, for example, children who are brought up on a diet of fatty, salty, sugary foods, who are, as a result of that, they are overweight, they are physically unwell because of that. That's also a form of nutritional neglect that we do need to be tuned into. And I've worked with families where they've been on child protection plans as a result of nutritional neglect because of the work between social care and health, where we've been able to identify that the care that they are receiving in terms of the child's diet is causing significant harm to that child's well-being. So on to the next slide, please. And this is the work of Claudia A. Bernard from the Goldsmith University, and Dr. Bernard does a lot of work in relationship to neglect and affluence, and deals with some of the challenges that we experience in terms of working with families where neglect is an issue. So what Dr. Bernard said is identifying neglecting parenting in the context of material affluence is a multifaceted process. Social workers, and I would also add the team around the family in that, have to navigate complex power relationships with highly resistant parents who have the economic, social and cultural capital to resist their interventions. One of the things we need to then think about are some of the perennial issues that come up time and time again in terms of our interventions with families. These are things that we find again and again in local serious case reviews and local child safeguarding practice reviews. Go to the next slide, please, and I'll take this sort of one by one, if we will. So one of the issues that keeps coming up is professional curiosity. And what do we mean? It's about what do you see, what do you hear, what do you know, what does it mean, especially for the children. It's about asking those additional questions. An excellent example comes from the Blue family serious case review, which we published recently. And this involves a police officer who went to a home to deliver a housing warrant. So it was around housing, but because of their training around safeguarding, particularly around neglect, was professionally curious about the state of the home and the outside yard and blacked out windows and twitching curtains and so on and so forth, and really had a gut feeling about this, and then decided to escalate things, access the property, and then they were able to find that these were children that were being electively home educated. They weren't known to the local authority. They were not well known, I would say, to the local authority, and there was a huge amount of concern. These were children who had moved through multiple local areas. As we went through the piece of work as a result of this police officer using professional curiosity well, we were able to protect these children from continued sexual abuse, neglect, etc., and so on. Authoritative practice. And when we mean authoritative practice, we don't mean authoritarian practice. We're talking about using practice wisdom, professional authority well, emotional and intelligence like compassion and empathy, relationship building skills to engage and support and contain families. When you think about neglected families where neglect is a factor, oftentimes parents have not received consistency of care themselves. They have disorganized attachments, and then we come in as workers, and they have worker who works with them for 3 months, then disappears, and another worker comes, and they're having to retell their story, re-traumatize. How do we build those relationships over time? And it's about us thinking about, and we can't do nothing necessarily about the churn in workers, but what we can do is think about networks where there is a consistency of professionals. So thinking about primary schools in particular, where primary schools oftentimes work with generations of the same family and have a very good relationship, and using the school or the network that has the best relationship with the family as a single point of contact while maintaining children's social care as the lead professional. Think about neglect and cumulative harm, moving away from incident-driven approaches, but also thinking about the impact of issues like domestic abuse. If I'm in fear for my life, how am I then able to focus on the needs of somebody else? If I am coercively controlled to the point where I have no self-efficacy, I have no agency or choice, how then do I effectively care for children? Similarly, with things like parental substance misuse, if I'm in the grip of an addiction, how can I then prioritize the needs of the child? And it's about children's services working together in a family way, see the child, see the adult, see the adult, see the child, making sure that we're not distracted from child protection because we're overwhelmed by the issues that the adults are presenting with. Okay, another issue that comes up again and again is effective, relevant, and timely information sharing. Sometimes we get caught up in the consent to share issue. It's about how can we work on an informed, open, family inclusive way. When we think about families' information, it is their information. So how can we, from the very beginning of our relationship with them, work on a consent-based model that explains to them that we will share information with services, and the purpose of that is to support the family. It's not about taking children away, but it's about getting the family and the children the support they need in a timely way. Engaging with fathers and males in the family, again, a perennial issue that comes up again and again. And part of this is about the invisible male or the missing male or the under-assessed male. And what we mean by that is if you have a family with children, there must be some male figure around somewhere because you've got children. And it's about thinking through what is the impact of that man in the house. Is that man in the house or around the family, is he a source of strength and stability, or is he a safeguarding concern? It's about having the conversation and knowing, not coming to judgments, or not having your understanding of the male mediated by the other members of the family, but having an assessment by virtue of your engagement. And so we might want to think about how we develop skills around engaging men effectively in safeguarding. And then, of course, related to the issue of fresh threshold discussion and decisions is the whole thing about escalation and professional agreement, and the need for us to have consultations and discussions with each other, which places the child at the very centre of our discussion. And so it's not about resource, it's not about threshold, it's about what is going to keep the child safe. How can we do that well together? And so using things like consultation and escalating things as a way of keeping children at the very centre of our intervention. So that's all I have at this moment. I'm going to hand back to the moderator. Happy to take any questions as needed.
I used to love school. It was great in the juniors, and my teacher was really kind to me. It's not the same now I've gone to high school. I want to do the homework, but I get in trouble because I don't get it in on time. I can never find my stuff, and there is nowhere in the house quiet to do it. If I put it down, it gets thrown out, or screwed up for firelighting. My favourite lesson is food tech, because we get to cook and then take them home. It's really embarrassing because I never have the right ingredients that I'm supposed to. So we use my mate's stuff and we share. I love PE, especially when we go swimming. I can't now because I've got really bad verrucas. The PE teacher says I've got to get rid of them before I go in the pool. They sent a letter home, but my mum didn't get the right stuff to get rid of them. She says they'll go away on their own. I have a really short temper, like Darren, and it's worse when I'm tired. Sometimes the other kids wind me up about stuff. I've lashed out a couple of times at school, but nothing serious. Mum and Darren are really chilled, not like some of the other parents. They let me stay up till midnight, and I get to go on the PlayStation. As long as I'm not in the room that they are, they don't mind me being up. Sometimes I fall asleep playing games, and I wake up the next morning on the floor or on the chair. I'm late for school most days, but I get away with it. I think my teacher expects it now, but he doesn't say much. We used to have some women come from the social to help my mum, and it was better for a while. They help her with the tea in the house, but she doesn't need them anymore. I'm getting older now, and I can help out more. There is some after-school clubs that I'd like to join, the boxing and the football, but my mum says I've got to come straight home. She wants me to pick Kimberly up on the way back home. I know it's hard for my mum, having the younger kids and all. I don't want to cause troubles between her and Darren, because he can get nasty. So I just do as I'm told, and I help out with the younger kids. Because Darren says I'm really lucky. He gives me a roof over my head. And he doesn't have to, because I'm not here.
Hello, I'm Alex Dove and I'm the project manager for the Graded Care Profile 2 project in Surrey. And I'm here as part of your Lunch and Learn session to tell you a little bit about the Graded Care Profile 2 project and the neglect screening tool in Surrey. As you'll be aware, probably from your session today, neglect is a significant concern impacting on the lives of an estimated 1 in 10 children in the UK. And the challenges in identifying, assessing and intervening when a child is experiencing neglect are many. In Surrey, we know there is much more work to be done to better support neglected children, especially those experiencing chronic neglect and the cumulative harm that comes with this. As such, the Graded Care Profile 2 and the Short and Neglect Screening Tool are being introduced and embedded into practice across Surrey Children's Services, health, education and voluntary sector partners. The GCP2, Graded Care Profile 2, is a licensed tool developed by the NSPCC, meaning practitioners have to be trained and licensed to use it. The tool has a comprehensive framework that requires practitioners to gather evidence and from this evidence measure the quality of care that a child is receiving using a grading scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the best care to 5 being the worst. This tool has been shown to help reduce subjectivity, bias and ambiguity, which we see so often in assessments relating to cases of neglect. It also helps us to answer that tricky question of what good enough care looks like, and to also compare and measure change over time, which in turn informs us about the support and interventions that are required and successful to support the child and family. The tool can be used, and we'd encourage it to be used across the partnership from universal through to specialist services, so that we can help families as early as possible when concerns of neglect start emerging, and hopefully therefore prevent children from experiencing significant harm as a result. But where professionals from universal and early help services complete a GCP2, and this results in concerns of moderate or severe neglect, then the GCP2 should be used to support the request for support to Surrey's Children's Single Point of Access. Practitioners can use the tool individually, but it also lends itself well to be used by multiple partners within existing structures such as Team Around the Family and core groups. When multi-agency teams use the tool, a holistic and detailed picture of the child's lived experience can be gained, helping professionals to take the most appropriate action together to improve outcomes for the child and the family. So if you're interested in attending a Graded Care Profile 2 training, please book your place on one of the many upcoming courses via Olive. In particular, we'd like to see as many social workers, family support workers, health visitors, home link workers, designated safeguarding leads, inclusion officers, school nurses and youth workers attend. If you're from a partner agency who has limited contact with children and families, then it's unlikely you'll be able to use the GCP2 in its entirety, which is why we've developed a shorter and briefer neglect screening tool too. This tool can be downloaded from the Safeguarding Children's Partnership website by anyone, and it can help you to identify whether neglect may be present in a family that you come into contact with and what to do as a result. This tool can also be used as part of your evidencing of concerns when making a referral to Surrey's Single Point of Access. We cannot continue simply doing what we're doing currently when it comes to those children who are experiencing neglectful care. So we really hope and believe that these tools will help you to help more children who are experiencing neglect, both earlier and with a more sustained impact. So if you're interested in either GCP2 or the neglect screening tool, please have a look at the Surrey Safeguarding Children's Partnership website, or please speak to myself, Alex Dovey, for more details. Thanks very much.
Thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you will take something from this session into your daily practice and use it for ongoing discussion to improve your awareness and work around childhood neglect. We will leave you with 3 slides from the Surrey Children's Services Academy that details the learning offer, including workshops on neglect. Any further questions can be directed to the partnership team inbox, details in the Q&A chat. Thank you very much.